So I was in town for a while, and then I lived in the South for a while, in Southern Illinois. But I'm back in town.
But never in the Chicago area.
I think I'm going to get us started here, guys. Hello, everyone. I am Madeline Crispell. Hello in person and hello online. I am the curator of the Chicago Maritime Museum. Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased tonight to get to talk once again about these very special 5 paintings in our collection by James Bolivar Needham. Now, if you were here almost exactly a year ago, you heard me talking about these 5 paintings as part of a larger talk on new acquisitions to the museum. If you heard that, you knew that I had put forward an attribution of these paintings. I'm happy to say since then we've confirmed the attribution and I've discovered all kinds of new things about this artist and this work. So I'm very excited to fill you all in. So, oops. Now, like I said, the 5 paintings came to us last year in or I guess 2 years ago now, December of 2023. They came from the collection of Philip R. May. Now, Philip R. May was a native Chicagoan with a lifelong interest in the Great Lakes. He was a chief engineer and lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, and he was also the Commodore of Belmont Harbor at the Belmont Yacht Club for a little while. Now, these paintings came to us as part of a donation from his wife, Anne, and I want to thank the entire May family for their generosity once again. Now, here are our 5 paintings all together. Now, we still have not had properly lit professional photography, although these are much better photos than I showed you last year, because they were taken by our former museum associate, Garrett Walensky, who was a BFA in photography at the Art Institute. So got a much better picture, but still, you'll notice when we get to other photos, the lighting is not perfect. Now, I'm going to break down these 5 just so you see all of them. We have this interesting vertical one where most of the canvas is taken up by the water in the sky. We have this one, which I love because you can see the position of the artist on the dock, but also that mix of smokestacks and church steeples that make up the skyline at this point in the background is so fantastic. This one is one of my favorites always because of all of the color and the reflection on the water. And this one, I just love seeing Chicago bridges, a classic train trestle bridge done in the hand of an impressionist artist. This is one of the only ones we think we've geolocated. Last year, when I gave this talk, someone came up and said they thought it was Goose Island. Seems like it very well may be. And then this one, the last one, which I love, you can see the artist is sort of sitting in a coal barge here, some kind of coal receptacle. And to see all of the smokestacks from the boats and the buildings above, I love that, cause and effect. Here's the coal, there's the smoke. But you get an idea in all 5 of these paintings of the sort of subjects that this artist was interested in. Now, here are them all together again. It's time to talk a little bit about my detective work, and I'm only going to retread some of this a bit since I know some of you already know this. But, I did not have much to go on when these paintings entered our collection. You can see they're unsigned. They were unattributed. What I knew from the family that donated them, these are 5 paintings of the Chicago River from the turn of the century. They're oil paintings. They all, you can see, share similar subject matter, all maritime, all Chicago on Chicago's waterways. And then I had a bit of a hint. Anne had told me that her husband, Philip, years earlier at a dinner party had offhandedly said he thought the paintings may have been the work of a Black House painter. So I've got some interesting clues, but I had a really key clue, and that was the material that I was working with. So this one painting, one of my favorites, and all 5 have been my favorite at some point or another, but you can see this one was framed in a sort of interesting way. a bit of the wood paneling that forms the back of the frame was left visible when it was framed around the canvas. And if you look closely, it is not ordinary wooden planking that you would use on a painting. You can see there's nails, it's planked. These are shipping crates. So this gave me a huge clue, you know, that it's shipping crates rather than regular wood backing the paintings. They're oil paintings. They're from the turn of the century. They look plein air. That's the impressionist, the French term for paintings done in person. And so this gives me enough to start Googling. And so some version of this, whether it was Black House Painter, Plein Air Chicago, or, shipping crate, impressionist artist, I don't know what got me there, but I found a notice from the M. Christine Schwartz collection, which is a group that's also donated paintings to us. And they had just donated 4 paintings to the Art Institute that were all by James Bolivar Needham. Now, when I first read that name, that was a name I was not familiar with, but very quickly he has become one of my favorite Chicago artists. Now, you can see here our 5 paintings next to the Art Institute's 4. Now, remember what I said, our lighting in our photography is not quite as good, but they were very clearly to me the hand of the same artist. So it's not just the similar subject matter, the similar compositions, oil paintings, same time period. All of these are done on shipping crates. Now, you can see, I think I'm on the right track, right? But still, he never signed the fronts of his paintings. What will give us our positive attribution? Now, Needham didn't sign the fronts, but he did something to the backs of his paintings. He had a very distinctive red diamond shape with the dimensions and sometimes the date underneath. Now, I'm not going to show the whole video because you can hear how excited I am in it, and it's a little embarrassing because I was thrilled to not have my, Al Capone's vault moment. But this summer, WGN came and filmed me taking the paper off the backs of our 5 paintings, and I'm very happy to say, revealing 5 of those diamond shapes with the dimensions in them. Now, there are all kinds of interesting things going on with the backs of these paintings. I will talk more about that later in my, questions unanswered section. But you can see all 5 have that diamond shape. Inside the diamond shape, all have a monogram. 3 of them have a more complete date. I should say these are organized. The back is above the front of the corresponding painting. So I futzed a little bit with the, direction they're in to make it more obvious. Now, they all also have this other kind of numbering system. And again, I'll talk about that later. Now, at this point last year, this is where I launched into a bit about Needham's background and family history. I knew even then that Needham was born in Chatham, Ontario in 1850. He was Black, and so we made a historical assumption that his parents traveled the Underground Railroad. Chatham was considered the Black Mecca of Canada. This is William Siebert's map of routes taken on the Underground Railroad, and you can see many of them end in Canada. After the Fugitive Slave Act, to actually attain freedom, you had to leave the country. You couldn't just go to the north. Now, last year, this is where I moved on from this part of the talk. I had to tell you I did not know much about Needham's parents or his family history, or about how they journeyed on the Underground Railroad. And I am very happy to say I have a lot more information about that. Partly that's from me diving into the archives. Also, Wendy Greenhouse, the former curator of the Chicago History Museum, has been very generous sharing her research with me. So now we know his parents' exact route on the Underground Railroad. So around midnight, the night of May 22nd in 1849, Needham's parents, Simon Bolivar Needham and Francis, and his older brother Will, who was then just a baby in arms, left the plantation they lived on near Charleston, Virginia. Later West Virginia, but at this point still Virginia. Now, according to one newspaper account, Simon used the roof of the dwelling his family had lived in to create a raft that they rode the currents of the Kanawha River to Gallipolis, Ohio. That's where they crossed the Ohio River into the north. They had been intending to meet up with some friends who were abolitionists who they couldn't find. However, they met up with two young Black boys on the other side of the bank who immediately took them to the home of Henry Bell, who was a prominent abolitionist in Ohio. Now, Henry Bell then ferries them on the Underground Railroad to Mansfield, Ohio, which is that middle dot, and then to Sandusky, where they take the John Owens steamer to Detroit. And from Detroit then, where they arrive on July 10th, they're ferried to Chatham. So all told, the journey takes about 2 full months, but they end up safely in Chatham, Ontario, where Needham is born. Now, there are all kinds of interesting things that are in newspaper accounts from Needham's father, Simon. Some of those need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, and I'll explain why later. But it seems that much of that Underground Railroad narrative is true. And I've just found in one of these articles an interesting excerpt. Needham, Simon, his father, quotes one of his favorite verses of a song, I'm on my way to Canada, which was written by Joshua McCarter Simpson in 1852 using the same tune to Oh Susanna, which I'm about to butcher. It was part of a project to turn minstrel songs into liberatory songs. So it's, I heard the Queen of England say, if we would all forsake our native land of slavery and come across the lake, that she was standing on the shore with arms extended wide to give us all a peaceful home beyond the rolling tide. So I quote this excerpt not just because it was Simon's favorite, but because of how much the waterways are a part of that song. You know, Lake Erie, the tides, these are all part of the vocabulary that people are using to describe their journey to freedom. And as you can see, and this is an excerpt of the map, you know, waterways were a huge method for people fleeing to freedom. Now here, one exciting thing we found, a portrait of Simon Bolivar Needham. Now, interestingly, he is described as a Jewish prophet here. I will try my best to briefly explain that in a way that doesn't sound nuts. He eventually starts describing himself as the reincarnation of Simon, the Hebrew prophet in the Bible, who was Jewish, and so naturally his reincarnation has to also be Jewish. And so that is, I think, what's going on there. Like I said, he was a colorful figure. Most likely, he was not very present in his son's life. He was arrested for larceny in Ontario, and he was in prison from 1854, when Needham was a 4-year-old, to 1861. And it seems after the prison sentence was over, he did not return to that family, but settled first in Michigan and then Wisconsin, and then spends the rest of his life traveling and preaching the gospel and doing all of these interesting prophet activities. He pops up in the historical record at different times in interesting episodes. For example, in 1887, he predicted the birth of the Messiah in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The widow Clark was going to give birth to the Messiah, huge news. When the widow Clark had a baby girl, he was promptly arrested for adultery. But I'm happy to say the couple later married, so happy story to that one with the widow Clark. And just briefly, one of my very favorite excerpts is from the Detroit Free Press. And I apologize in advance to anyone here or at home watching from Marquette, Michigan, which, again, from Detroit. The other day, the Free Press received a circular which announced itself as a voice from heaven. And as communications from such a source have a certain flavor of rarity nowadays, this voice certainly demands attention. Suspicious circumstance about the voice is that it was in an envelope postmarked Marquette, which, except in persons of great faith, would cast a shade of improbability on its celestial origin. the circular is signed by Simon B. Needham, who announces he is also the author of A Voice from Hell. And so perhaps he sent the wrong document from Marquette. Now, just a little aside to give you a sense of the many, many rabbit holes I am avoiding telling you about during this presentation. And to support my theory that you could tell a history of Chicago just through Needham's life. Albert Parsons, the anarchist and the husband to also anarchist activist Lucy Parsons, when he flees after the Haymarket affair, where does he end up but Waukesha, Wisconsin, where he is a congregant at Simon Needham's church. He was there posing as a carpenter under an assumed name. One of the other congregants said he had heard that he ended up in Waukesha because of a connection to Simon. Simon Needham denied knowing him, said he was very quiet and reserved, but just an instance, there are so many more things we're going to be able to find out. This is from 1 year of research. Imagine after 5. So, but like I said, as far as we know, Simon did not have much to do with James. And so I'm going to get into James's life. So James's older brother, Will, gave a long interview with a young journalist after James died as part of his obituary. And so we have some interesting color about his early life. We know that as boys, Will and James ran cattle and horses from Chatham to Manitoba, but whereas Will was very content to stay in Ontario, he said that his brother, he called him Jim, was always restless. Now, Jim had always loved boats, apparently, and winds up working on lumber schooners, like the ones you can see here, although not these exact ones. He started working on the lumber schooners around age 14, and he would sail out of ports like Detroit, Bay City. He was mostly active on Lakes Huron and Michigan, mostly in the lumber trade. Now, when he turned 17, he had been to Chicago as part of those ports, and he decides to settle here permanently. Now, Will, his older brother, would later say to that journalist, you know, me, if I had come here then, I'd be a millionaire now. But Jim, he was different. He never cared for them things. He liked water and boats and such, and he liked to paint. Now, when he first arrives in Chicago, he does different sort of odd jobs. He's a porter at the Sherman House Hotel before it burns down, some kind of job at the Carson Prairie Scott building. It's still a little bit unclear which chicken or egg comes first, but he ends up as a painter decorator at the Chicago World's Fair. Now, why I say that chicken and egg, James Bolivar Needham encounters at some point Laredo Taft, who is the head of sculpture for the Chicago World's Fair. Now, we don't know, does that happen before the fair and that's how he gets the job? Or is this job how he encounters Taft? This is an area that we don't know enough about. There's some reference to his older brother showing that journalist a clipping from an article from 1893 about James falling and breaking a leg while he was doing painting, but I haven't been able to track that down yet. Again, so much still to learn. Now, either way, it's around this time that James meets Laredo Taft. Now, he's on the left here. And someone his brother would always remember him speaking very highly of, although he could not remember the exact nature of their professional relationship. Like I said, Laredo Taft was the head of sculpture for the World's Fair, but he was also an educator, a teacher, an artist, and he was very much known for promoting arts education for people who were traditionally left out of a 19th century arts academy. So for example, he did a lot of arts classes for immigrants. When Daniel Burnham expressed concern that the sculpture ornament on World's Fair buildings would not be completed in time, Taft asked Burnham if he could employ women to do the rest of the work that needed to be done. Famously, Daniel Burnham said, if you get white rabbits to do it, that's fine, as long as it's done in time. And that class of young female sculptors became known as the White Rabbits and were some of the most celebrated female artists of their day. Now, as far as we know, Needham was completely self-taught. I've seen reference in articles to him never having had a color class. His brother thinks at some point he studied with Taft. The Art Institute has no record of that happening officially. So it could be that he gave him some pointers in an unofficial way. We just don't know. On the right here is Hamlin Garland. He was a writer and the brother-in-law of Laredo Taft. And in 1894, the two men founded the Central Arts Association, which was a group meant to promote Midwestern, particularly Chicago artists, and also to create exhibitions of traveling shows that would go to different small Midwestern towns that didn't have big art museums. Now, the Central Art Association included Needham's work in at least two different of their exhibitions. One in 1894 at the Art Institute, and one in 1895 that traveled. And both men specifically reference Needham in writings and lectures, in all kinds of material, as being one of the artists they particularly respect. They talk about his work as being very direct and interesting. And at the meeting of the Central Art Association, Garland specifically points to Needham as an example of the sort of art they should be fostering in the Central Art Association. Now, besides those two exhibitions, and I'm sorry, these are my blurriest of my photos, he was also exhibited in an 1897 exhibition at the West End's Women's Club. These are newspaper reproductions of his work that was featured in one of those exhibitions. And the coverage they get in the arts papers of the time is, at least the Chicago papers, universally celebratory. Now, there's one particular interesting line of praise that he gets, which is only in Chicago could an artist like this succeed. You know, painting the Chicago River at this point is like painting the Dan Ryan today. It was the most industrial, polluted corridor of the city. It did not make sense to paint, especially in a period, you know, think Hudson River School. You want a river to be a beautiful, natural, untouched thing, not something with smog and boats on it. And so only in Chicago could the Arts Academy appreciate work like this. And only in Chicago could a house painter, which, as they refer to him, achieve artistic success. It's in New York City, you have to be a fancy schmancy artist already. Here in Chicago, a janitor can succeed. Now, there's an excellent quote by the Chicago Inter-Ocean critic. I'll just read part of it. Exactly what I'm saying. The Inter-Ocean had the courage to speak of his work as being good. Some Eastern papers scouted the idea that beauty could be found in the Chicago River. And it did require some courage to say at one time, and at the same time, that a house painter might have genius and that the Chicago River, under certain conditions, is picturesque. Which I think is a very interesting comparison, humble origins for both the artist and his subject matter. Now, that's a little clip of that piece and also some of the covers of the Inter-Ocean's Illustrated Weekly. Now, that art critic always is credited as LVN in her articles. This is one of my big exciting discoveries in the microfilm at the Art Institute. Her name is Lucy Van Never. So we have a female art critic writing about a Black artist in 1895, something that is not happening that often today in Chicago. Now, Lucy Van Never had written about Needham before, clearly as she references in her articles. And at some point, Needham writes her a letter. This is the only thing I have been able to find anywhere that's in Needham's own words. And it's a beautifully eloquent philosophy of his artistic practice. And I think it does a really good job of describing why his work is so special and unique compared to some other contemporary images of rivers that you would see. And so I'm just going to read you a piece of that letter that he wrote to Lucy Van Never. So after saying there's nothing genius about his work and it's just fine, he says that people should sit down in a pile of bricks and that they should cross deserts and oceans to sit in a special pile of bricks to get ideas of or about nature is to me insanity. I appreciate the value of the schools, but I suppose if we stripped of everything related to art except the impulse and were related to barbarism, we would paint and would go to nature for our models. We are consciously or unconsciously students of form or symmetry. I suppose artistic expression is a heritage. A plowman striking his initial furrow calls into play the same elementary things without which the master's work would be valueless. So clearly there's some surprise from the art critic that a house painter could create this work. Needham is not surprised. Needham sees all people, regardless of how you're spending your day, as being able to access art in some way and see in nature something about art they want to reproduce. Now, this is where Needham kind of disappears from the historical record. We're able to track his houses in Chicago. A friend of mine at the Chicago History Museum sent me every address he ever had. We're able to know what jobs he had at different times, always a caretaker, a janitor, according to those census records. But it's not until he dies in 1931 and a long, detailed obituary by a young journalist who had ties to the Chicago art scene is published that he appears again in the record. So this obituary is previously most of what I was going on in my research. I now also have his death certificate. So this is a important document for a number of reasons. This is how I know Needham's mother's name. So Simon Bolivar Needham had been in, newspaper articles. Frances, born in Culpeper County, Virginia. It's all the information we have about her, but I have a name now. This also lets us know where Needham was living before he died in about the month between the fire on New Year's Eve that claimed an unknown number of his paintings and left him with the smoke inhalation that would later kill him. He was living at his niece and nephew's at 443 West 56th Street, which is a block with almost no houses standing anymore. Which again, that urban renewal, houses being torn down on the south side, there is a connection to everything in Chicago history with Needham. This is also how I learned where he was buried, which is one of the things I wanted to discover at Burr Oak Cemetery. So finding exactly where he is one of the things I'd like to eventually do. So, Needham, we have this amazing story, but I want to emphasize how much the waterways are a part of it. This is someone who owes his existence in part to the waterways. His parents traveled a river, crossed the Ohio River to freedom, took a steamer to Canada where he was born. He spent his formative years as a deckhand learning to love the water and the boats that sailed on them. He ends up in Chicago, a city very closely tied to the maritime industry, and he's interested in depicting that industry. And you wonder, as a Black janitor, how many places could he have comfortably painted in Chicago? A dock is somewhere where he could have set up his easel and not been bothered. Now, this brings us to the questions portion of my talk, but not your questions yet, my questions. I have been staring at these paintings for a year now. So there are all kinds of things I wasn't even thinking of last year that are now big questions for me. So this green boat, it had been noted already as being one of the more unusual depictions of ships. His other boats, whether they're schooners, paddle wheel steamers, are pretty well done. He clearly has an eye for detail. This one, not the case. But you can see in this little picture I have of just the masts, it looks like there was some rigging around them that was painted over. And you can see that red monogram. It's a little hard to see with the light. It looks like there's a black diamond shape with dimensions underneath it. So, this is me speculating. Is this something that was painted over and he painted black over the back because he felt it was no longer finished? I don't know. And I mean, to look at the backs of them, what are those other numbers? So for example, here, September 8th, 1899, it's a 6.5 by 10-inch piece of paddle or shipping crate. What does 70 mean at the top there? Or over here, August 19th. What is 93? It's clearly 1905. Was he numbering his paintings? It's not chronological. Maybe it's numbered for that year or that month. Now, there, like I said, other things that we can draw from this. I'm speculating that the two that only have dimensions, that don't have the longer date, may have been unfinished. That's the green boat and that little paddle wheel steamer that's framed in the unusual way. Those are certainly feel maybe a little less composed than the others, but again, this is all still speculation. Now, what about the other paintings that are out there? According to Jerome Beam, who was that journalist who wrote the obituary, the two young men who lived across the hall from Needham end up being the people to get his entire artistic estate. His brother Will is in his mid-80s. Needham was 81 when he died. He didn't want to bring all of these paintings back to Canada, and you have two young enthusiastic artists right down the hall who really love this work. You know, we don't know how many survived the fire. We don't know how many are out there. Our 5 paintings, unsigned, if you just saw the back of them, you would not know who did them necessarily. We have no idea in the attics and closets of Chicago how many other Needham paintings are out there. But I mean, there's so much else too. How was he educated? Yeah, when did he learn to read and write? What was his relationship with his father? How did he get in touch with Taft? And what happens at the end of the 1890s that makes him leave the art world? Now, like I said, I have a lot of questions. You may too. So thank you all so much for coming today. And please, if you have any questions, let me know. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Why do you figure he painted on shipping crates as opposed to say like a canvas?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm gonna go up to one where you can see the backs. So it's a little hard to see in the photos. The canvas on some of these is totally wrapped around the entire back. On some of them, it just goes on the edge. On one of them, it's just the front. Shipping crates would have been plentiful and cheap, and he was on the docks all the time, so that's what he had access to. Canvas and paint would have been the 2 most expensive things. So, you know, I figure that little paddle wheel boat, maybe he's just being frugal with his canvas use. But yeah, he would have used them because they were cheap and around and on the docks where he spent his time.
So they all do have a canvas.
Yes, all of them are on canvas, but the canvas, you know, wraps around the wood. Yes.
Use paint.
Oil paints. It would have been pretty available in Chicago. Total aside, I took some conservation science in grad school, and we learned a lot about French impressionists and expressionists who had to buy really cheap paint that had fugitive dyes. And so, you know, Monet or Van Gogh's famous white roses in a vase started out bright red. Within his own lifetime, they faded to being a pale pinkish white. His famous bedroom, all of the colors are totally different. He knew that. He knew he was buying the cheap paint that wouldn't last. It does not seem to be the case for Needham. He doesn't have the kind of characteristic muddiness in some of the colors, and blues still come through, which would be one of the more expensive. So it seems to me, and this is again me doing some historical speculation, that he was buying a higher quality paint that could have done that many places in Chicago. Yes.
So the 4th one that it's, can you flip to the backside?
Uh-uh.
Can you make out with the shadow?
Is this what you mean?
Yeah. With the shadow from angle?
Yes, so it's the same dimensions but upside down. So it's also 8.5 by 11, but flipped, which is part of what makes me think, you know, maybe this was reused. According to that journalist, his studio was just piles and boxes of paintings. And I wonder, you know, would he have had everything facing back and then just looked for the dimensions of the kind of piece he wanted to make that day to bring it with him? I would love to do all of that. I mean, I would love to bring an electron spectrometer in to tell me what all of the oil paints are made of. But the way to make that happen is to donate to your wonderful Chicago Maritime Museum. So I'm sure at the end of this talk, we will have more than enough funds to do all kinds of weird science stuff, right, guys? Yes. Paddle wheel. It's kind of it's the image a little bit. It has had some loss of paint though. No, it seems like that's part of how it was stored at some point. The little red one you can see has some black gunk on it too. I'm speculating, could that have been soot from the fire in the studio? All of these things made it out of a fire. So, it makes sense there's some damage.
You know where else any of his other pieces are?
Yeah, so there are 18 at the Chicago History Museum, although they have not been showing them publicly. There are 4 now at the Art Institute because of that donation from the M. Christine Schwartz collection. And there are a number in private collections. And, after I gave this talk last year, I had a couple different people come out of the woodwork to say, oh, I have a Needham, send me a photo. One of the things I'd really love to eventually do, and Wendy Greenhouse and I have talked about this together, is developing some kind of catalog raisonné of all of his work that we know together. Most of them are like this. There are a handful of nature landscapes, so it really is interesting to look at them all together. You get a second question, sure.
So,
Uh-huh.
So how is it an untrained artist came into impressionism as a style? Because I would have thought it would have been a very avant-garde art style at the time.
Right.
So why isn't he just painting kind of like a naive realism?
Sure. So it's my younger brother, folks. He's a aesthetics and philosophy student. Great question. So it is and it isn't avant-garde. 1871 is when Monet's Impression Sunrise is painted. It is what gives us the name Impressionism, which was, of course, initially an insult. It was impressionistic, eventually becomes the name of the entire artistic movement. But that's, he starts painting, it seems, in the 1880s. Chicago is a center of Impressionism. People like Bertha Palmer bring a lot of Impressionist work to the Art Institute. We know he was at the Art Institute, not just exhibiting his own work, but he must have been there with Taft too. So it would have been something that he would have been seeing and incorporating into his own work. I think an interesting point, we have another painting back next to the Needhams by Albert Fleury. He was a French artist who came to Chicago in the 1880s in order to paint murals at the Auditorium building. And he's a very classically trained Academy Beaux-Arts French painter. And you can see he composes a similar subject matter. He painted Goose Island in a totally different way. There's a lot less pollution. There's some smoke, but it's been cleaned up. He's situated himself in the middle of the river in an impossible location, whereas Needham, you always kind of get a sense he really is sitting where he's painting. For Fleury, I sort of think it was harder for him to access this kind of impressionism because he had, the structure of his classical schooling. For Needham, it's like he says, his education is nature. And so he's putting down his impressions of the natural world. So it makes sense to me that this is a style he ends up with. Yes.
Searching more into Chicago art or what he might have attributed.
The Central Art Association, you mean? I am super interested in learning a lot more about the different exhibitions that he was involved in. And there are 3 that I have definite records of. It seems like there may have been more. At least one of them was a traveling show. I'm so curious to know what are the different places that went to. We sort of know some of the pieces that he showed because they're reproduced in newspapers. And there are a couple, maybe 2 or 3 of his paintings that have signatures on the front. So I wonder if that was something that was exhibited and he had to sign the front of his painting, as opposed to, largely he was painting for himself. And so no need to sign it when you knew who made it. Do we have any questions from the internet, Jim?
Encourage them to write something.
Hey, internet, if you guys have any questions at all, please write them in the chat and Jim will let me know what they are. I can't see you or hear you or know how many of you there are, but I hope you have questions. Yes. That's another artist who was at that. Yes, so it's the Central Art Association had 2 traveling exhibits. One is Trilby, this other artist who painted cowboy paintings, apparently. And then the other is Needham.
What?
This is the Chicago Interocean. Yeah. The Interocean seemed to be real big proponents of his work. Interesting aside, never in any of the articles, never in any of the mentions from Garland or Taft is his race mentioned. I talked to a friend who's an expert in sort of 19th century Chicago politics. She said that the Interocean was a particularly progressive paper and that it made sense to her that they would be wanting to promote this artist, but I don't know, did they know Needham was Black? It's not clear. Bill?
His father's name,
Yes.
Simon Bolivar was.
Yes.
Missionary.
Yeah.
So how was this first name get named? I think that's an interesting. His family.
That's exactly why he would have been named that. I mean, that amount of cultural knowledge of world news clearly made it into the realm his parents were living in. This is where the newspaper articles are really tricky. He claims that his mother was a white Jewish daughter of a prominent Richmond businessman who was kidnapped into slavery and forced to marry an enslaved man. That's how he was born. Is this in order to say that he is the 7th son of a 7th son, just like Simon in the Bible? Yes. Is it so unlikely that a white daughter of a merchant in Richmond would be kidnapped into slavery? Also very unlikely. However, he was named Simon Bolivar. I had theorized before I knew his father's name that James had been named with that abolitionist spirit in mind, the great liberator of South America, but he's named after his father. And so who named his father? That's a huge question. And, one that I think we can probably suss out. There's been amazing work done lately in the history of enslaved families, and I'm hoping we'll find something out. Well, yeah, Waukesha. I have to go to Toronto, Jerry. I'm sorry. I have to go to Toronto. I have to go to Springfield. There are all kinds of places I have to go to track these down. Marquette, no. Marquette, we're the voice from hell. What the Detroit Free Press said. But yeah, there's a lot of, things to chase down. And Wendy has done fantastic work, but Wendy works on a number of different artists and she can't go to Toronto to look up this one article that might, unspool everything. So yeah, there's a lot that could be out there. She has written on him for a book, Art in Chicago. She's also written on him a catalog entry in the Schwartz collection, but there have not really been other scholars to look into him. And so who knows what's out there still? That's obviously a very exciting problem, right, for me. Uh-huh.
They loan you is
What a really good question. So I what I would love to see happen eventually is some kind of multi-institution exhibit in Chicago where we and some other kind of museum tell this story, because I think it's something that you need a lot of different facets to really understand. And you have to approach him as an artist who cared about his artistic practice, who was part of this context of Impressionism in Chicago, and who was doing, I mean, really cool work for this time period in a way that other artists were not doing. But you also have to approach him as a historical subject, as somebody whose life was so influenced by the history of the waterways in the region. And so I do think that the Maritime Museum is sort of uniquely poised to tell that story. You know, there are a lot of Needham paintings out there. I'd love to see them all reunited eventually. Yes.
Things. Can we locate where he was sitting?
I'd love to. Yeah. So that paddle wheel steamer one in the middle is really, I would love to figure that out, because it seems like you can see a bit of a sign on one of the buildings. Snyder something, Cart Cafe. It's hard to read. I just, you know, so many stretches of the water would have been exactly those kind of brick warehouse buildings. It's a little hard to identify, but my dream scenario is to one day have a self-guided tour around Chicago to see the different places Needham painted. Always thinking of things in terms of tours. Well, if there aren't any more questions or aren't any questions online, the paintings last year were still in my office. I'm very happy to say that now they are on the wall. So like any impressionist, the texture, seeing them in person is really important. So sorry, people at home, but the people in the room can now head back and look at these spectacular paintings in person. Thank you all so much. Thank you online for coming tonight.